All right, everyone, we've come to that legendary moment where Joe Biden managed to combine two gaffes into one. Yes, that's right, he finally did it. Normally it's like, now it's a day-to-day occurrence, basically, or at least like, sometimes he takes the weekend off, typically in Delaware, going biking and hopefully not falling down like that other time. Joe Biden normally, though, only makes one gaffe at a time. He might make multiple gaffes in the same speech, but he doesn't manage to combine them into one fucking paragraph. Link in the description. Please watch this. It takes the cake so far. This is our 10 out of 10 Biden gaffe moment, at least thus far. At least in the verbal sense. Of course, he's fallen down numerous times, broke his foot chasing the dog in the shower, and constantly gropes teenage girls. But as far as the verbal side, the political side, takes the cake. He's addressing inflation in this statement and saying, well, inflation's a worldwide problem. Technically, he's correct. Inflation has taken off in numerous countries in the world. There are holdouts that aren't hyperinflated at the moment, and the United States is not the most inflated. I mean, technically speaking, although we use sketchy metrics, we're not at the top. Venezuela's at the top, but they always drop it off the list so that socialism isn't implicated as the reason. By the way, if you look at a list of nations with high inflation, you'll notice that there's more state control in those that are inflated right now. In anarchic states that are run by various military guerrilla groups, there's no inflation. I mean, there's no economy either, but there's the saving grace. Thankfully, guerrilla faction number 1 is the one that runs this area. Their currency is a little bit better. We use cockle shells instead of cockle burrs. It's much, much better because they don't eventually rot and fall apart. You can make all sorts of jokes about underdevelopment, although it is sad for the people living under it. He then meanders off into trying to blame the war in Ukraine for the inflation, which makes absolutely no sense. He's tried this before. Inflation has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. It doesn't help. Certainly, sunflower oil prices are up, in part because of that. I think 40% of the world's supply comes from parts of Ukraine, half of which are currently occupied. That's not great. Cabbage prices probably impacted too, and certainly it does throttle certain grains and energy prices as well. But we already had high inflation before that began. It was already, 6.5 or something before the war was triggered. Now it's stabilized. It's above 8% and roughly linear, which is better than the alternative, I suppose, that Bidenomics keeps making it worse. More to come in 2023, I'm sure. I assure you of this fact. And they'll blame it on Republicans. That's the other hypocrisy here, before we get to the second part of his gaffe that makes it even more crazy. Right now they're saying, oh, the whole world has inflation. It's not my problem. Blame the war in Ukraine. The second the midterms end, it will automatically become the Republicans' fault. All of a sudden, because they don't have a plan on inflation, it's their fault that it remains high. They're already angling to do this. They're already angling to blame the inevitable incoming recession, world recession, on Republican Party. It's interesting. People who are not even in full power have full control over the economy. Biden, meanwhile, with both chambers of Congress, he blames everything on the Russians. But then he makes it worse, because then he says it's not because of the war in Ukraine, but because of the war in Iraq. So you've got a lie, followed by gaffe number 1. He says war in Iraq instead of war in Ukraine. He then corrects himself, but somehow he manages to work in yet another lie and gaffe. When he says, well, no, I mean the war in Ukraine, not the war in Iraq. And I'm sorry, I was thinking about it because that's where my son died. No, your son did not die in Iraq. He died in a medical facility in the United States. He died because of brain cancer. It may have been caused by exposure to depleted uranium, and Biden has posited this for a number of years. I'm not entirely unamenable to the concept that he might somehow have been exposed to radiological material that caused cancer, although we can't prove it necessarily. It's sort of like a Gulf War syndrome thing. It's plausible, and it really should be looked into. Biden's not wrong when he says this. But your son didn't die in Iraq. The war in Iraq had nothing to do with the current economic situation. You're talking about Ukraine, and the Ukrainian war didn't cause the high inflation in the U.S. Your policies roughly mimic the policies of other countries that have a top-heavy approach. mainly Europe, parts of Asia. Lockdownerism, that was more prevalent in some countries than others. And if you look at the list of nations that are suffering from significant inflation rates right now, it correlates very nicely to there being more state control and less confines on state control in general, number one. And number two, lockdownerism. How long were the lockdowns? How much did they impact business? Etc., etc. How much did they impact trade? How much did they impact ports and shipping? That's a big one. In the United States, a lot of the ports were closed. The inflation rate, therefore, rose proportionate to the fact that trade wasn't happening. Supply and demand came out of balance. The lockdowns were excessive. They lasted for a long time. They often affected businesses for the first half year, crushing small businesses, by the way, in the process. Joe Biden supported these things. He is more centrally responsible than anyone else in the United States for the current economic crisis because of that advocacy for what effectively, and this is a cop-out that Democrats use, effectively a state-level measure, a state-level response. It was under a national emergency measure, but state governors picked and chose what kind of lockdowns they had, if any. That is also true. But Joe Biden has, technically it's a triple gaffe. You're deflecting on inflation, although that's more of a lie than anything else. Right before the midterms, a week to go, and he's blaming the war in Ukraine again. He's taken 2 steps back and explaining inflation. And then you have a double gaffe on top of that. This is legendary. By the way, it really is a retrogression. Joe Biden last year, at first he said there is no inflation. Then it was labeled transitory. Then they started blaming the war in Ukraine, briefly blamed Trump, and then said, well, it's just world inflation. He's mixing two together in this particular nonsensical and incoherent spiel that he has here. More lately, they've said, well, yeah, the inflation's high and it's bad, and they've stopped bothering to deflect because voters are punishing them for it. But the Republicans have no plan to deal with it, so vote for us anyway. Vote for us so that we can continue to deflect and pretend the inflation is not a problem, as we leer out from our penthouses and ivory towers over you peons out there. Now, that's going to, by the way, go over really well at the polls. Double gaffe. We've finally seen it. He has evolved. His Alzheimer's appears to have advanced another point because clearly now he's become even less coherent. He's capable in one paragraph of making several lies and irrational statements all in the same go. But the legacy media won't talk about it. Liberals won't acknowledge it. They'll say, well, he was trying to get through his stutter and he started getting nostalgic about his son, despite the fact that he didn't actually die in the war in Iraq. That's about all. Peace out.